All right, guys, now for the concepts of raising the sword, something that takes the technique from pretty to practical. So for example, drilling techniques is good. It's to help us get into different movement patterns that we wouldn't normally do, different dexterity or economy of motions. So from a position of a sucker punch or my handshake, I need to protect my face first. So I'm going to be hitting with my left hand in a symmetrical grip, adjusting my right foot and coming out to 130. When I'm doing that, I'm trying to put all the emphasis on my opponent's wrist to try and lift that hand up so it's impeding the ability of throwing that left punch at my face. I hold it there, striking to the solar plexus or armpit, depending on how they're rotated. I crescent step, move out to the other side, strike into the ribs, a little lower than the armpit in this position. When I come out, I'm doing my cat stance in a crescent step, pivot out, extend the arm, and a hammer fist strike towards my opponent's elbow. So this is a pretty technique and it's nice and flowy, but we can take some really good lessons from here. So for example, number one, I may not be strong enough to pull my opponent's hand back when they're throwing that punch, but I may be able to catch that angle by surprise and get their hand in between them and their punch. With an opponent, I'll show you what I mean. So with my opponent, again, they may be bigger than I am, so I may not be able to pull in. So as they throw the strike, I'm going to move towards that strike and get lots of pressure on the wrist to get my opponent up here. I get that first strike in, okay? When I adjust here, I'm lifting that arm and I don't want to shoot straight through. I want to strike to make a little bit of space. I come through and keep that wrist locked and hammer fist the elbow. So learning how to take small pieces from each technique is very, very important to start building yourself a bit of a program on how to defend yourself and what works for you and what doesn't. So for example, taking that initial piece and getting that hit and that lift is very important. So I would stress training the position of getting a symmetrical grab, hitting with enough force that you can lift that arm away and block that punch. So just make sure that you're not trying to step first and then lift that hand, you'd be off balance, but hit slightly before that left foot steps up towards 130 and get that pressure. Now, there's a lot of wrist locks in Kenpo and things of that nature. When I come through and do my rotation on that, I'm not trying to get a specific swan lock or center lock or wrist lock on my opponent. I'm actually just moving my hand around their wrist. So when I get to that point, if I'm here, 1, strike, 2, I'm in my forward bow, strike, I adjust, come to my cat stance, and pivot out. I'm allowing that wrist to rotate in my hand so that I could effectively try and strike that elbow. If that elbow's facing 12 o'clock or straight up, it's much easier to get the hyperextension. If I let that elbow go to 3 or 9 or in any other direction off of that, it's going to be much more difficult. I'd have to change the way that I strike towards my opponent's elbow to effectively get that hyperextension or that break. My opponent is sucker punching me from a handshake. I adjust, I come up, get a lot of pressure on that wrist with that symmetrical grab, a lot of weight and pressure. Strike with the elbow into the ribs, come back, forward bow and adjust and lift and raise that arm. Strike with the elbow into the ribs. Adjust, cat stance, and out. So it follows our long, short step, big step principle. So for example, in Orange Belt, we do a technique called passing the horizon, where I'm going to be coming out in the B variation. I hit. If I take 2 big steps here and try and rotate my opponent down like that, I've lost the grip because of distance. So I want to do the theory of small step, big step here. So if I was going 1, I go to my cat stance, pivot, and step back into my longer stance or my fighting stance. We're doing the same principle here. So raising the sword. Adjust, cat stance, start to pivot, fighting stance, or longer pivot. Mechanical variations. So for example, if I have a much shorter range than my opponent, this would be a good technique to use in this sense. When I start raising the sword like this, I'm coming in very close, so I don't need to have a lot of reach in order to be successful with that elbow strike. Same as on the other side. If you were a shorter opponent, it would be much easier to get underneath the arm to finish or execute the technique that way. If you're the larger, possibly taller opponent, that might not be the best course for you. There are other techniques. So for example, if I were here, simply being in a position where I pull that hand in can take a lot of pressure out of the opposite shoulder. If we think about it this way, if I'm shaking hands and I'm trying to punch someone, this shoulder has to come forward, or that side of my body needs to come forward. And if someone can pull on this hand, it can somewhat neutralize this side. I don't want to teach that it would stop the punch by any means, but if I was here getting punched like that, and I can step back and really reef on that hand, I can take a lot of momentum out of their punch. And that's raising the sword.